Hello, guys. David Vose here again. Another beautiful day. It's warm today, and I'm sitting on the porch. Got back from my trek into town yesterday. What a nightmare trying to go to town. But anyway, I got the things I needed and decided to do another video to get deeper. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get deep so that we can literally and truly understand what's going on. Now, up to this point, we've been talking a lot about the Masons and how it began, and Knights of St. John and Mary Magdalene. If you haven't seen all those videos, clear back to where, was it a week or two ago? We started off talking about Columbus. And of course, we've been doing videos building up to this, foundational points, learning a lot of stuff. And in the meantime, we learned a lot of things about esoteric wisdom and, gardening and science and everything else, because that's what we do. We just want to know everything. But particularly, we want to know things not for no reason, but so that we can get to the bottom of some very important things. Like, why are we here and what the heck are we doing here? And is there anybody on this earth that knows what's going on? Is there a conspiracy to destroy us? And these are important questions, and many of us we have a need to know the answers to these questions. Because sometimes faith is just that. It's kind of like you got to have some kind of faith to even have the courage to suspect that there may be an answer. If you get to the point where you don't believe there's going to be any answer, that's fatalism. That's gloom and doom. So don't anybody accuse me of gloom and doom and fear-mongering, because though I do believe that this world is going to go through a cataclysm, I believe we should, warn people. Do you know that Paul Revere was one of the grand masters in those early days of the Masonic order? Yeah, we hear stories, but we don't hear the punchline. We don't really know what's going on. Oh, some guy named Paul Revere got on his horse, riding through town. The British are coming. The British are coming. Well, who's Paul Revere? A very important person. So we're trying to trace the Knights of St. John. And if this is really true, the Knights of St. John, and the story that Jesus told John the elder on the cross, he looked down and said, take care of your mother. That woman's going to be your mother. You take care of her. And then in 2 John chapter 1, verse 1, where John the elder actually says, yeah, the lady is here and she sends you greetings. The lady, all right? It's not just some lady, but in those days that word meant the chief lady, the Lord, the Lord's wife. And he says, you're her children. So this got started. We've talked all about the Languedoc and the Knights of St. John and the Fisher Kings, and we've come down now to America. And we've noted that the Statue of Liberty is from France. We've noted that the Knights Templars were from this area originally, and then were pushed out into Spain, and then they came over to America in different ways. We talked about Sinclair, a bloodline of Christ, and the Vaux line, the Waldo, Peter Waldo, and Saint Bernard de Clairvaux, which is both the Vaux and the Clare or Saint Clare line. We've talked about one of the original presidents of the Continental Constitution who was a Clare, a Saint Clare, literally not just a Clare. He was a Saint Clare, meaning he was related to the family of Sinclair, who established America, a bloodline of Jesus Christ. and other founding fathers. And we've now been getting to this place where we're talking about Benjamin Franklin. Do you know, guys, just how important this man was? It's odd because you go to Washington today, and what do you got? Well, first of all, it's called Washington, right? After George Washington, who they wanted to become Grand Master of Virginia, but he refused it because of his military service and his integrity, the love. And he knew that he couldn't be a minister of peace and philosophy while he was murdering people. But he was not murdering people to murder people, but to protect. They certainly believed, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, in having guns to protect against tyranny, to form a militia, to protect ourselves, not some multi-quadrillion industry, and shadow governments murdering people in other countries for no reason because of financial issues and mafias that run the world. The military industrial complex. No, that's not what that was about. And that's not what George Washington was about. You see the pictures where he's off of his horse praying before he goes into battle. George Washington, in one battle, all his men were killed and shot. And yet he came out unscathed. But when he got home, he dropped exhausted off of his horse. And he says, "Oh my goodness, I barely made it alive." And they took off his coat and noticed that he had 4 bullet holes in his coat. Not one of them pierced his skin. So, you've also probably heard the stories about the angel that visited Washington, almost like a prophet, like the prophet Daniel. It's like, son of the Republic, listen and learn. And then he tells him all this stuff. It's brilliant stuff. But there is some question as to whether that happened, what supposedly happened. I mean, it wasn't, George Washington was too modest. He didn't write that. He didn't say that happened to him. We don't have a record of him admitting that he saw an angel and the angel said, "Son of the Republic, listen and learn," and then gave a prophecy. But we had people years later saying that they knew this happened to him and this was stories and they wrote it down. It may not be true, but everyone knew the idea or the persona around this movement, Paul Revere and these individuals that were great men. But it's funny because all these men, Thomas Jefferson is known for writing the Constitution, but actually he was more of a scribe. He was really writing a constitution, apparently coining phrases and whole paragraphs from other people. They were from Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and also from a man named Voltaire and John Locke, which we'll talk about. So here's what's really, really, really interesting. And I think this is where the conspiracy or the deep dive into the reality of this conspiracy, to understand it. Like, what went wrong? Were there no good people in our world? I mean, if indeed the Knights of St. John were true, amazing, inspired individuals from the deity above watching over mankind and guiding us to the place that he wanted mankind to go, he certainly inspired the Constitution for a reason. And as I've said before, I believe that Jesus, when he was resurrected and left this world, told us that he was in charge from that point forward. He went to the right hand of deity in heaven and had all power in heaven and upon earth. So why all the evil? Well, because as Jesus said, he gave everybody talents and he told them to go do good with their talents. And if they didn't do good with their talents, then they would be unfaithful. And then when he returns, he's going to reward and punish those who did bad and reward those who did good. The whole thing is explained in all the parables, that he planted a seed and it was a a seed of a little mustard tree, and it would grow up to be one of the largest of the trees. So there's a plan here. Ultimately, the last battle is going to be a mental battle, a spiritual battle between good and evil. We're down to that place now where they're not really fighting with bullets as much as they are with the mind. So we know that the Constitution was divinely inspired. We know that the descendants of Mary Magdalene and these knights, that's what they called a priest in that order. Knights that were ordained or knighted by someone who was ordained or knighted by someone who was ordained or knighted by Jesus Christ, who had ordained John, and they protect this kingdom, the child of this woman, which is her descendants, which is the kingdom, which is us, the children and the seed of this kingdom. So they're going along and they're being persecuted. We saw the Waldensian Inquisition. We saw the Spanish Inquisition. We saw the Huguenot Inquisition. We saw them come to America, and we saw the character of Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, and John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, and John Adams, and all these people. We saw their integrity and their utmost allegiance to liberty and justice and equality among men. And yes, when they first did the Declaration of Independence, they didn't immediately start forcing slaveholders to get rid of their slaves and saying, this is a country of Christ, we're not going to allow this evil. But it was a place where the majority at that time they were coming out of the world, and they had plantations and they had slaves. And what they had to do then, they had to have a majority. It had to be a consensus amongst the people. Moses couldn't force the Israelites to serve the true and living deity because they didn't understand the light or the love. They wanted vengeance, so he gave them this veil, this priesthood, this material world where we could be temporary and make mistakes. But that's why we vote, and we have representatives here. They're going to represent the people. Now, if the people have come to a place where they've advanced, but not yet, not far enough, they still don't want to get rid of their slaves. Well, if the majority of men are of that mind, then what do? Well, Benjamin Franklin and Voltaire and John Locke and Thomas Jefferson wrote words to enlighten mankind, to advance equality and liberty, and then slowly get men who were faithful to be good stewards, and at that time it was a high calling to run for office. You were really trying to help men, and you said, this is what I stand for. Liberty and justice and equality. And those who looked at you and said, what? You want us to just give people charity? That's my stuff. You couldn't explain it. You had to teach them that love was better, that giving was the way, that forgiveness was the path. So Jesus did that. The apostles did that. It came down after they had been murdered and killed and thrown out of every country they'd ever lived in or been, all the way building libraries and trying to educate and trying to advance the world. And they get to America, they said, here it is. This is the spot. And they put up a flag. Oh, what a flag is terrible. Right? Well, it's the red, white, and blue. What does it mean? It means that the stars on the one side and the blue or the dark black on the one side was the stars and the night. But there came the little red stripes, right? And which is the rays of the sun, the dawn's early light. Oh, say, can you see? By the dawn's early light. They knew what they were doing. This was their symbol, the beacon, the Statue of Liberty. I'm so sick of people saying it was everybody's saying, oh, it looks like a trans woman out there. What is it, a man? Or who is it? Is it Lucifer? No, it is not Satan. That's not what the Statue of Liberty is, guys. Oh, man, get a life. Start using your noggin. I've tried to explain to you that if some people in early times used the word Lucifer, they meant it in the sense of light, not in the sense of darkness, because Lucifer's means light. Yahweh is the deity of vengeance who threw the one who wanted to be like the Most High down to hell, which was Jesus Christ, the light bringer, the morning star. But people, for the most part, never called that statue Lucifer anyway. It is a woman, okay? It is a statue of a person holding a torch, which is light, okay? Stop making mountains out of molehills. It's called the Statue of Liberty. You know, if you got up close and looked at it and said, oh, she's ugly, well, that's your problem. Nobody ever said that we're putting up Satan in the harbor and we're establishing a kingdom for slavery here. This was a kingdom that all men were created equal, and there's justice and liberty for all. And these men were patriots. None of them can you besmirch their integrity. These men were of the highest reputation. And you couldn't find one thing to besmirch that reputation if you looked. What you are finding is other Masons down the road after they infiltrated. And I'm going to read you here in a moment that even AI recognizes what that infiltration was. AI, I got them to admit the whole thing. And I'm going to show you that it is the Bavarian Illuminati that was established at the very same time in 1776. Not because they were affiliated, but because they were opposed. Just as the Knights of the Golden Circle assassinated Lincoln, not because it was a plot to confuse us by making us think that they're the bad guys when they're really the good guys, or some crazy thing like that, which is maybe what they're doing today, which we're going to show you. But that's not what Benjamin Franklin was doing. That's not what Thomas Jefferson or Washington or John Adams or any of the rest were doing. They couldn't even have thought of such ridiculousness. But the bad guys certainly were trying to stop liberty and justice and freedom. And there was a real battle, and the Civil War was real. And I wish I could just read you all the testimony of the reality of this battle that was going on prior to the Civil War in the courts and with electing people and people assassinated and people spending their lives trying to educate the masses, as Benjamin Franklin did with starting the idea of having a community library where you could check out a book and bring it back, and starting the idea of education in schools. You know, remember the little house on the prairie? They had schools way out in the middle of nowhere in the West. They tried to, and those children were learning to read and write, and they were reading true history. Most of those people back in those days actually knew what was going on. It was right away, though, that the infiltration happened. The Bavarian Illuminati, 1776. And I'm going to tell you about something else that was going on in 1776. In 1776, in Paris, France, the lodge called the Nine Sisters was established. And guess who the Grand Master of the Lodge of the Nine Sisters was in France? Benjamin Franklin. It was because of the French Lodge and these Masons that were about fraternity and liberty and equality of all men. And if you don't believe that they really were, go read Voltaire. Benjamin Franklin's best friend. That philosopher penned those words that's in the Constitution. That's where it came from, our Constitution. It came from Benjamin Franklin and his protege, Voltaire, the greatest philosopher, John Locke, another great philosopher, who, though he lived in England, in London, ended up going on pilgrimages to Montpellier. And some of you not familiar, that was the capital of the Languedoc, the 7 cities, Septimania, of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene, where the Knights of St. John started, the Fisher Kings, down through the Merovingian line, and Sinclair, who stubborn Nova Scotia, and his friend and Sephardic Jew and Christian and Mason Columbus and the District of Columbus and Columbia and British Columbia. And all that is because of these men from Bernard St. Clair Vaux of the lineage of Peter Waldo, who owned 169 cities, towns, and villages along the Rhone, all the way to Paris. And that lodge was a lodge of such beauty and advanced thinking in liberty. And they believed in Jesus, yes, because they were descendants of Mary and Jesus, for St. Peter's sake. Think about it. Yes, you're right to suspect conspiracies, and there were plenty. But the conspiracy is to get you to stop believing in the Constitution and your liberties and this divine document. Because we now are in the apostasy. That's what was predicted. It was right there predicted. False prophets and false teachers and false Christs shall come. Do not believe them. And every man shall be against his neighbor. Father against son, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And that means race against race. And this is what it's coming down to. But don't worry. We've already, all of us, been told we know what good is. Now we got to go by our conscience. Benjamin Franklin did his thing. He established the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, Voltaire, and John Locke did the best they could. Go read the philosophy of John Locke. Natural law. That's what they believed, not the law of men. Because they wrote in there, you shall make no law that will restrict my freedom. My freedom is absolute. I have the liberty to form a militia and run out your tyranny, and I don't have to be taxed. The first thing is the right of free speech, and it all hinges on that and the freedom of religion. And it doesn't mean that you have the right to pick between some false cult and another false cult. It means you have the right not to be religious, because religion is a snare and a racket. They encouraged you not to spell his name correctly. All you people out there, it's Yeshua. It's Yeshua. You've got to say Yeshua. It is not Yeshua. You're wrong. His name is Isa. The New Testament was written in Greek. Stop with this Hebrew roots crap. Yeshua, or with the Yah in it, is not his name. His name was Isa. The Arabs call him Isa. The Hindus call him Isa. And in the scriptures, it's Isa. Yeah, there was a us on the end, Isus, or an Isun, because that's syntax. But his name is Isa. And he is the Savior, the Son of Deity, the Son of Man, the Messiah. And he taught grace and freedom and love and forgiveness, and not the law, because the law doesn't teach forgiveness. It says if you commit an infraction, you will die. And therefore Jesus died, because all men are going to take up their cross and follow him. Cursed is anyone who is hung upon a tree. And we're all cursed under the law. It is a bondage and a curse. And we have been freed from the law. And we're under no law, but we're under grace and love. And this was what was taught by Voltaire. And this was the sayings of all men are created equal from Voltaire, John Locke, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, who was the scribe for the group that started in France in the tradition of Mary Magdalene in the Lodge of the Nine Sisters that was established in 1776. So the lodge was established in 1776, and at that very moment, once they established it, that brotherhood of men, led by Benjamin Franklin, Voltaire, and the rest, came to America and declared independence. But at the very same time, the evil people that were in Bavaria and the Bohemians established the Illuminati, which was not for liberty, but for infiltration to stop the movement of peace and the kingdom of Christ. And I will show you that from AI itself. But first, let us take a little look at the institution we're speaking of, the Lodge of the Nine Sisters. I'll take a look. The connection between the Lodge of Nine Sisters and the Bavarian Illuminati is complex and primarily based on their shared historical context within the Enlightenment and Freemasonry, as well as some overlapping ideals, but without direct evidence of collaboration or affiliation. Here's a breakdown. Shared Enlightenment ideals. Both groups embraced Enlightenment principles. Both the Lodge of Nine Sisters and the Bavarian Illuminati were products of the Enlightenment and valued reason, progress, and individual liberty, promoting intellectual discourse and social reform. They both sought to challenge traditional norms and promote societal change through intellectual discourse, and in the Illuminati's case, the Bavarian Illuminati, potentially more subversive means. The Illuminati infiltration of Masonic lodges. The Bavarian Illuminati sought to infiltrate and influence existing Masonic lodges to spread their ideas and recruit members. The Lodge of Nine Sisters Masonic affiliation. The Lodge of Nine Sisters was a prominent Masonic lodge known for its intellectual and cultural focus. Potential for Illuminati influence. While there's no definitive evidence of the Illuminati infiltrating the Lodge of Nine Sisters, the potential for such influence existed, given the Illuminati's goals and the Lodge's Masonic nature. Differences in the goals and the methods. The Lodge of Nine Sisters, open nature. The Lodge of Nine Sisters was a more open and public forum for intellectual discussion, promoting Enlightenment ideals through its membership and activities. The Illuminati's secrecy and subversion. The Bavarian Illuminati was a secret society with the goal of overthrowing traditional institutions and establishing a new world order. They aimed to achieve this through a secret network of influence and potentially subversive means. Separate entities. There's no concrete historical evidence to suggest that the Lodge of Nine Sisters and the Bavarian Illuminati were directly collaborating or affiliated. Distinct aims. While both groups shared some Enlightenment ideals, their ultimate goals and methods were quite different. In summary, the connection between the Lodge of Nine Sisters and the Bavarian Illuminati is largely circumstantial, based on their shared Enlightenment context and the Illuminati's attempt to infiltrate Masonic lodges. While they might have had some overlapping membership and shared ideals, there's no conclusive evidence to suggest a direct link or collaboration between the two groups. I think I smell a rat. I think I smell a rat. The whole Nine Sisters blows me away. Benjamin Franklin was the Grand Master of the lodge in Paris called the Nine Sisters, and was also the Grand Master here in America. And both the Lodge of Nine Sisters and the Declaration of Independence in America was in 1776. However, the Bavarian Illuminati was also created in 1776 by David Westphal. But as they show here, what seems to be the difference is that the connection seems to be the dates. All three of these groups had the same date. I suspect that the Lodge of Nine Sisters is definitely related to the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, because Benjamin Franklin was the Grand Master of both of these groups. And Benjamin Franklin was the ambassador to France at that time. So he spent time in France and in America. And Voltaire, who also, I believe, had some, you can clearly see that Voltaire, who was a Mason, part of the Nine Sisters, philosophical guy, one of the most famous and influential philosophers, certainly had a hand in shaping the Constitution of America, even though he's from France. Because a lot of the wording came from John Locke and Voltaire, both of which, well, John Locke was from England, but spent a lot of time, get this, in Montpellier, France. So the roots of this type of philosophy and this particular Masonic branch was France, no question. And those French roots influenced Voltaire, who was very, separation of church and state, individual rights, and all of the things that, the very wording that our Constitution has were things that John Locke as well as Voltaire wrote. And they were very good friends. I mean, Benjamin Franklin and Voltaire were best buddies. So obviously, they spent time together and they influenced each other. If they didn't, I mean, it would be hard to believe that Voltaire and John Locke didn't almost shape the U.S. Constitution, which only means that it was this philosophy and the goals of these men from France to start a nation in America on these principles. And since it was the Illuminati who also was established in this year, it seems that they were doing it on the grounds that somebody else was doing this to escape their little snare. And so the Bavarian Illuminati knew that in order to stop this enlightenment and freedom and justice for all, they had to influence it by infiltration and force and, really evil means, do everything they could to stop it. So I think they purposefully established it in 1776 to counter what was going on in the Nine Sisters and in America. So we see here that AI is saying that they tried desperately to infiltrate. So these are the two sides, but we're going to have to dig a little deeper. So Norman Vincent Peale is the one that's mainly and usually credited with this power of positive thinking. But he didn't coin the phrase. It was actually coined by another man named Charles Fillmore many years before, during the slave issue. And of course, Norman Vincent Peale was later on in the 20th century, but early in the 20th century. But, we know that Donald Trump attended Norman Vincent Peale's church. Norman Vincent Peale was a 33rd degree Mason who was influenced by Charles Fillmore. But here's the connection. Charles Fillmore's brother, Millard Fillmore, was the president of the United States about the time, just before the time of Lincoln, when they were still trying. Remember, the Knights of the Golden Circle murdered President Lincoln. That's a fact. John Wilkes Booth, who shot President Lincoln, did so because of the slave issue, to stop Lincoln from freeing the slaves, emancipating slaves. And I will tell you, it did work, and we'll show you how it ended up working, even though the slaves here in America were emancipated. But the President Lincoln established martial law. And after he died, of course, whoever killed him took over. And we'll show you that. We'll prove that. They took over the Congress and got power and started murdering and, getting rid of, in one way or the other, those who supported freedom. Even though our Constitution, our history says we emancipated the slaves, what we ended up doing is creating the birth certificate, which is slavery for every man, woman, and child in this country, so that they could then demand minimum wages and, on down the road, and paying people, which is continuing to have slaves, but paying them for it so they could get away with it until they could come up with a system like they do today, where it's just complete slavery everywhere. You're a slave to the state. So they did that so that they could obfuscate, make slavery without people even knowing they were slaves, get people to like slavery. But John Wilkes Booth, the assassinating man who killed, by the way, he was very much a movie star. So today, the big movie stars, the elite, are not your friends. They're trying to enslave you, because the whole party of propaganda, that's one of their things that they established, and they took over. Aleister Crowley and all of this got into this, the satanic church and the rock and roll. It was a plot to keep us down, make us like slavery. So if Lincoln was the good guy, that must mean that he was, that the good guys were winning. And they had to do something. They had to infiltrate. And the first, and they couldn't allow Lincoln, so they killed him, not only to get rid of him, even though they'd already done what, Lincoln already accomplished what he accomplished, but to make an example. People were afraid. They knew they would be assassinated. They knew about the Knights of the Golden Circle. But you see, the president before Lincoln was Buchanan. I think it was James Buchanan. He was, it's known, publicly known, that he was a Knights of the Golden Circle member. So they had already begun influencing and infiltrating, and we've already seen how the Bavarian Illuminati was established in 1776, the very year that America became independent and signed the Declaration of Independence. They did that not because they were in cahoots with them, but because it was the two sides trying to win this battle. Those for freedom from France, from the Nine Sisters, the Lodge of Paris, that Benjamin Franklin, by the way, was the Grand Master of. Yeah, in France, as well as the Grand Master in America. Benjamin Franklin was the head honcho. And when he died, and his, John Adams and Washington and Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, and when those people died, the influence, the infiltration was already going on. This was the reason for the Illuminati, the Bavarian Illuminati from the north in Germany that we keep talking about. They were created to infiltrate and deceive the world by propaganda. They couldn't destroy them by outright wit. They couldn't get public speakers to out philosophize Benjamin Franklin or his compatriots. So they deceive, they turn to deception. But we need to know when this all began. Well, the Lodge of the Nine Sisters was disbanded finally for good in 1848. At that time, in the late 1840s and 1850s and 60s, this is when, just before the Civil War, it came to a bloody battle. Lincoln being the last of those who were in power, perhaps. And the guy just before him, Buchanan, was an avowed Knights of the Golden Circle, which were all authorized and financed. The Golden Circle was financed by all these plantation holders in the South who wanted to keep their slaves. So this continued on with certain individuals, including Millard Fillmore, who was a slaveholder. And at this point, there were still a lot of people who didn't want slavery in the North. So they had to use trickery. They had to put presidents in. They couldn't get elected by saying, hey, we don't want this freedom. We want slavery. So they would lie and they'd say, look, I'm neutral. I won't say. Right? And they'd appeal to one party or the other, and the Whigs tried, and this party come along and that party. But, the Knights of the Golden Circle started in 1854, right around this time when it was the end of the party of Franklin and from France. And then these people that were being infiltrated by the German Bavarian Illuminati came in, infiltrating the Masons, like Buchanan, Wilkes Booth, the movie stars, the theater. And just before Lincoln's presidency and death was James Buchanan as president, and before that was Franklin Pierce. And before Franklin Pierce was this Millard Fillmore. All of these guys were either the Knights of the Golden Circle or the ones who founded the Knights of the Golden Circle. Certainly, James Buchanan, just before Lincoln, was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. But Millard Fillmore and Franklin Pierce and certainly James Buchanan, well, all of them, were slave holders. And if you just look at their careers and all of their trickery and deception and what they did to further slavery, they're double talk. And then when Lincoln gets elected, they're like, oh no, we've got to kill him. So if you really take a look at it, just look at the history, you'll see that there's all this infighting and political scuttle-buttle and trickery, and people, oh, I'm neutral, and and then they double talk, and then all these different parties, and the Whig Party comes up, and the other party, and then they're infiltrated, and they have to abandon ship, and then another party, and it was just after that, it was just about nutso, and it never did get back to normal. We never got any more Benjamin Franklin's. They were few and far between. Maybe Mr. Garfield, who was shot, and Lincoln, who was killed, and Kennedy, who was killed. But beyond that, there were no freedom fighters and those who stood in their integrity, who understood the principles of true justice and liberty and equality of men. And so then just before Abraham Lincoln's assassination, we see Millard Fillmore owning slaves, and there's a lot of stuff that we can talk about with him to show he wasn't a friend of freedom. But it was Charles Fillmore who started and coined the phrase power of positive thinking. And we'll read that here and we'll prove that AI admits this. And so this means that as we'll see, that Norman Vincent Peale, Donald Trump's mentor, a 33rd degree Mason, was at this time a Mason that had already been infiltrated. He may have been one of the infiltrators. Norman Vincent Peale, who also was very close with Nixon. And think about the fact that Nixon knew and was at the meeting where they decided to kill Kennedy. And then immediately, and then Nixon becomes president. We see Nixon at the Bohemian Grove. Bohemian, Bavarian, they're right next to each other in this German area. The Bohemian Grove is an outpost created around the same time as the Illuminati in Bavaria. They set up shop in San Francisco by another Bavarian Illuminati member. And here we have Reagan and Nixon and all these people laughing it up, doing all these wicked things that Ben Franklin would roll over in his grave if he knew. And George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, all these people would roll over in their grave if they knew what was going on with these evil, wicked men like Nixon and Reagan And all the world's like, oh, we love Reagan, but what was he after? What was he for? More military, more of this garbage. Just say no. Friends, this is the years that the conspiracy began to root. So we don't know. You say, well, we don't know who Norman Vincent Peale was. Well, he's a Mason. So by that time, it was all infiltrated. And we know that he admired a known slaveholder who was a president. Now, so Charles Fillmore's brother was president, Millard Fillmore. So that's why Charles Fillmore was financed in his work, in his book. You say, well, what's wrong with the power of positive thinking? Well, have you ever gone to a church that was, because Charles Fillmore founded a church called Unity. I went to a Unity church. It seems all nicey-nicey, okay? Power of positive thinking, blah, 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 mantras, and, but they all stand in a circle. There's no pastor or anything. It's just a club where you all stand in a circle and mindlessly chant something like, oh, we got to stop the global warming. It's some, liberal, and they don't believe in Jesus. They never say in Jesus' name, amen, anything like that in their prayers. They don't believe in deity, really. Just your own power of positive thinking, which, if they understood what the higher mind was, they know that is Jesus and his Father in heaven. But they don't know. They're deceiving. It's a twist on the truth. So Norman Vincent Peale was tried to look like a good guy for the American people, just like Nixon, just like Reagan. It was a scheme. If you notice, Donald Trump, every time he does a speech or anything, he'll stop reading the prompter and look into the camera and say something over and over and over again. What we did was wonderful. It was amazing. And everything we're doing is great. It's never been a greater president than me. And I did the best and this and that. And he keeps saying it and saying it because this is the power of positive thinking, they think. It's not. It's the power of mesmerism, which is very close. Seems like it's the same thing, but it's not. Mesmerism, hypnotism comes from Satan. It doesn't. That's not what Jesus taught, mesmerism, saying things over and over again. Because it only works briefly, but you haven't changed your heart. You say things over and over again, you might manifest it, but then your life turns into insanity because you're not able to, you just get a flash, something you want, but out of lust. You're just repeating something over and over again, lusting for it. This is false teachings. So, look, there's something going on here, and this is what it says. The Unity Church was founded by Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, a married couple who were both religious leaders and co-founders of the New Thought movement. The New Thought movement. So they start getting right into your mind right away. Back in the 1800s, when this whole slavery issue was going on, and his brother was president, a slaveholder, who did manipulations to try and appease those who weren't slaveholders to appear neutral, but was really putting in place things like the Kansas, Nebraska, I don't remember what they call it. It was some kind of act that allowed Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves if they wanted to be slaveholders, which was a very huge blow to freedom because they had already established the principle in the United States that nobody could be a slaveholder above a certain line. In the North, they were not slaveholders. But Nebraska and Kansas was in the North. And therefore, if you could get them to make up their own mind, you could infiltrate their Congress and their parliaments or whatever they got up there, their senates, and you could change that law and then introduce slavery into the North. They tried also into the South and Texas. It was all these guys after Buchanan, after they shot Lincoln, they were all secretly taking over. What they took over really was the Democratic Party. This is with Albert Pike and all their revamping of the Masonic order into 33 degrees. You see, because the original Masonic order in the days of Benjamin Franklin and Voltaire, which we'll talk about, and John Locke, they didn't have 33 degrees, and they didn't believe or agree with any of this stuff. This was all the infiltration of the Illuminati, as we've already seen. So Charles Fillmore founded the movement with his wife, Myrtle Page Fillmore, in 1889. That's interesting because Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, she founded Christian Science in 1888. So this was kind of going on at this time. But I believe Mary Baker Eddy was the good side. She kept it simple. She believed in some very important truths and explained it in very important ways. And the church that she founded was Christian Science. Think about it, they were Christian Science. They put Christ's name on it. Whereas Unity was not Christian, but unity with all these other faiths, which is true. We're all one, we're all unity, but we don't want to unify the truth with the falsehood and the lies, which is what that came out to be. So, AI says Norman Vincent Peale was significantly influenced by Charles Fillmore's teachings and ideas, particularly regarding the power of positive thinking. While Peale acknowledged reading Unity and other New Thought literature, and even quoted Charles Fillmore, he also maintained that his philosophy differed from New Thought according to Truth Unity. Here's a summary of the relationship between the two. Influence. Peale was influenced by Fillmore's positive thinking principles. Fillmore's beliefs that people can achieve happiness through positive thoughts greatly impacted Peale. Borrowing. It is suggested that Peale may have borrowed the concept of positive thinking from Fillmore. Acknowledgement. Peale acknowledged reading Unity literature and quoted Fillmore in his writings. Despite the influence and acknowledgement, Peale believed his philosophy was distinct from New Thought tradition, including Fillmore's teachings. In essence, Peale was inspired by Fillmore's emphasis on positive thinking and incorporated these ideas into his own work, but he also developed his own unique approach and philosophy. All right, so just to show you that it is admitted by Peale himself that he was influenced by these slaveholder people that were all probably in infiltrations from the Bavarian Illuminati. Now, remember, this is something that it cannot be ignored. It's one thing to know of somebody or to live during that time or to be affiliated in some crazy, strange way, but Norman Vincent Peale and Richard Nixon had a supportive relationship, with Peale officiating, Norman Vincent Peale officiating at the 1968 wedding of Julie Nixon and David Eisenhower. Eisenhower? Oh, well, this goes deep. The extent. Peale was a close friend of the Nixon family. Close. Peale continued to visit Nixon at the White House during the Watergate scandal. He visited him, stating that Christ didn't shy away from people in trouble. The New York Times reported on Peale praising Nixon as a peacemaker during a church service in 1972, further heightening their relationship. Mutual admiration. Nixon praised Peale's leadership and direction, stating it had substantially fortified the moral fiber of America, according to the New York Times. Peale expressed thankfulness for Nixon's re-election and prayed for deity's guidance in Nixon's efforts to achieve peace. Peale's sermon themes often aligned with Nixon's political message and aspirations, suggesting a shared vision and admiration, according to the New York Times. Wow. They had a shared vision and had admiration for each other. In conclusion, Nixon and Peel maintained it, a supportive relationship with mutual admiration, with Peel being a personal friend of Nixon's family and a supporter of Nixon's presidency. Well, this leads us to something else. Now, listen to the way that AI phrases this answer. Because I asked him if Richard Nixon said that Donald Trump would become president. And they say, while Richard Nixon did not explicitly predict that Donald Trump would become president someday, he did support, or he did suggest, that Trump would be a successful political candidate if he ever chose to run for office. Well, let's put that in a little more context, because that makes it sound like he's just off the cuff saying some silly thing. Here's the evidence. In 1987, he wrote a letter to Donald Trump. Nixon wrote a letter to Donald Trump. The president writes a letter to Trump. It's not Trump writing a letter to Nixon, okay? Nixon recounted that his wife, Pat, had been impressed by Trump's appearance on the Phil Donahue show. I saw that interview. Many of you have. Why were people constantly saying, do you want to run for president? Remember, Oprah Winfrey interviewed Donald Trump and said, are you going to run for president? Would you be interested in running for president? Like what? Why are these people constantly interviewing this man and asking him if he wants to run for president? You say, oh, well, because he was a billionaire, Dave. Well, at that time he wasn't. He just had a few million. And there are lots of millionaires in the world that weren't interviewed like that. Sure, he might have been debonair and suave and had that smirky smile. And, well, maybe because he was going to all the parties with Epstein and he was, and of course, think about the people that Epstein was in cahoots with. Like the bank, what was J.P. Morgan and all this. So they were very powerful people, and they were the ones financing Donahue and Oprah Winfrey. And what about Rob Walters? This is 2020 with Donald Trump. Are you going to run for president? It was unreal. And then, voila, NBC, right? Isn't that the left? NBC gives Donald Trump a #1 series on television. You're fired, right? It was a stupid show. I didn't think it was exciting. What's the drama, right? Trump's going to come into the room and sit down. They're all going to sit around real quiet and look at each other and go, you're fired. And it was not something that anybody would think, you know what, I really like that show. I want to watch that show. But they just pushed it and pushed it. Kind of like when Star Trek, which I love, I got to admit, I'm a fan. Before I knew about all this, as a child, I was, my hero was Captain Kirk. But there was all of this, even the Spock sign, is a Hebrew rabbi sign for Yahweh. And so there was a lot of propaganda about going to this. I didn't realize that this concept, this NASA idea of going to the stars and the aliens and everything, and the little alien grays that they had on the show with the big bulb heads and all this stuff was propaganda. But when it first came out, it didn't do well. And they ran it anyway. Very few people watched it to start with. They thought it was stupid. Because originally it was kind of fake, like dress up day, it wasn't even like a real, they didn't have the technology to make it look real, but they kept pushing it and it became this favorite of many people. But it was all propaganda, and the whole Hollywood television, everything's run by, just like John Wilkes Booth was an actor, kind of like Johnny Depp or something today, or Brad Pitt, he was the big actor of the day. He's the one who kills Lincoln, a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, which I think became the Democratic Party and then took over the Republican Party. after Kennedy, I don't think there were any more good presidents. And Nixon knew about that. And I know he didn't pull the trigger. But the Bohemian Grove, all of this. So at that early date, they had already chosen Trump to become president. And then they had to promote him by giving him a TV show to make his persona as the tough guy, right? You're fired. So it says, and AI admits, that in 1987, Nixon writes a letter to Donald Trump. Wow. I mean, that's crazy. And Nixon wrote, as you can imagine, she, Pat, his wife, is an expert on politics, and she predicts, so they lied, because they can't lie right straight up. But technically, Nixon didn't predict it, but his wife did. But it was Nixon that used his wife. Remember Reagan's wife, Nancy, was involved in the occult and this kind of thing. And there was other, like with Gene Dixon and all these people in those days. But Nancy, or I should say Pat Nixon, predicted that whenever you decide to run for office, not if or if you choose, but whenever you decide to run for office, you will be a winner. So, you say, oh, well, coincidence. I mean, that's just her opinion or whatever. Friends, all these things aren't just coincidences. They planned it. And the guys that Trump admired, the ones that promoted him, his mentor, was Norman Vincent Peale. And that man was kind of like King Arthur and Merlin. Well, Norman Vincent Peale was Nixon's Merlin. They worked together. They stood together in shared goals and a shared vision and visited each other all the time. And Nixon was at the Bohemian Grove. We could go on and on with all of these coinkydinks. So then it goes on to say it's important to note, of course, don't start thinking any kind of crazy things like there's a conspiracy there, David. AI is real protective of my mental health here. They don't want me to start going crazy and start believing truth. So they say Nixon's statement was not a specific prediction of Trump becoming president, but rather an indication of his potential for political success. Nixon's opinion was based on his wife's assessment, not necessarily a deep analysis of Trump's political prospects. Really? He took the time to write a letter and send it to him. The two men had a friendly relationship, corresponded with each other in the 1980s and the 1990s. Really? Why would the President of the United States correspond with some guy? Like, who is this guy? Okay, he had $1 million maybe. But why was he going on Oprah and Donahue and Barbara Walters on 2020? What was going on to promote this build-up? I mean, everybody's talking about, all the late night shows talk about Trump. But yeah, they were told to condemn him and to make fools out of themselves, condemning Trump, to make them look bad so that Trump would look good. That's what they did. Who do you think this guy, Adam Schiff, is? The little pumpkin head. He's a ridiculous goofball. Constantly going out there, yeah, I hate Trump. Or how about this James Comey? Do you really think this is all they can get him on? Is there some seashells on the seashore? Say that 3 times in a row real fast. This is ridiculous. You can't prosecute somebody for making seashells on the seashore. And for one thing, he says he didn't do it. He just took a picture of it. You can't prove that he did. There's nobody else there except his wife. And they're going to back each other. There's no way you can indict James Comey for anything like that. He's just doing this because it's going to promote his book. All the liberals will buy his book. And most of you conservatives probably will too. Ha! Well, their letters covered topics such as football, real estate, and politics. Oh, and politics. Trump even invited the Nixons to reside in Trump Tower in 1983, which Nixon politely declined. Yeah, there's no question that Nixon was just an infiltration into the Republican Party. Now, after Lincoln, I don't know how many good people there were in there. You know, you might look into the President Garfield. You know, Mr. Garfield's been shot down, shot down. Mr. Garfield been shot down cold. Well, you know, we might take a little look at that just to see, you know, what the climate was after Lincoln. But by the time of John F. Kennedy, it's over. And why was these public speeches made, right? The Eisenhower speeches talking about the industrial complex taking over the world, and just before Kennedy dies, he gives this speech about, you know, secret societies taking over and stuff. Why isn't this noted more, talked about more? Why? I mean, not we talk about it, but why didn't somebody think, you know, I wonder if the presidents after Kennedy, like Nixon, right, Trump, who was his best friend, were part of this infiltration? I wonder. But anyway, I'm probably just gonna leave it here. We're over an hour now, guys. But boy, isn't it interesting, and I hope y'all understand what we're pointing out, what we're showing, the ramifications of what we're saying. That the United States was divinely commissioned, the Constitution, the people who were of the lineage, either literally or philosophically, from this French liberty and equality of men that had its roots going back to the Fisher Kings, back to St. John, Mary Magdalene, and Jesus Christ, and the 72, or the Sanhedrin, or the government that he established, which means that Jesus literally established these knights and inspired them to come to America and build up America to be a beacon on a hill. But we're going to leave it there. Hope you have a wonderful evening. Lord will bless you. His grace will be with you guys. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one.